Many years ago, I met someone at a conference in Sydney, Australia, who told me that he'd spent the last 12 months of his life reading business books, watching courses, all in preparation to start his own business. It was going to be a marketing agency. He hadn't taken any real actions or put any skin in the game. He hadn't actually started the business yet. He had been learning. He was stuck in what I call the learning loop. Always researching, always planning, but never actually doing anything. The learning loop is a common trap that you've likely found yourself stuck in before. You spend all your time learning and doing things around the thing, but not the thing itself. You read books, you watch courses, you listen to podcasts, you talk to people about your ideas, but you don't take action on them. Now, I am more guilty of this than anyone. So this is not me on my high horse talking to you like I've figured it all out. This is a constant struggle for me, but I have got better at escaping the learning loop over time and understanding why I fall into it. So what I'm going to share with you are some observations, some thoughts, and some strategies for improving your ability to do that. So here's what we're going to talk about in this video. We're going to start with why you get stuck in the learning loop in the first place, what causes you to fall into it most of the time, why it's so addictive and why it's so hard to escape, the difference between action-centric learning and consumption-centric learning. We'll talk about how to get addicted to real progress instead of fake progress that comes from being in the learning loop, and some strategies that can help you move further towards action-centric learning instead of looping around all the time, not making any progress. So let's dive in. Why do we get stuck in this learning loop? It's tempting to think that the learning loop is simply a modern problem. With the internet, information is more accessible than ever. You can download pretty much any book you want for free or pay $10 on Kindle. You can listen to one of the hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of podcasts that are out there on various different topics. You can scroll Twitter for hours and machine gun your brain with new ideas and insights and tactics and techniques and so on and so forth. But this problem is not new. It's something that humans have been dealing with for a long time. Samuel Butler in the 19th century found himself lamenting about the uselessness of knowledge acquired uncritically. He says, "There's nothing less powerful than knowledge unattached and incapable of application. That is why what little knowledge I have has done myself personally so much harm. I do not know much, but if I knew a good deal less than little, I should be far more powerful." We know that knowledge by itself doesn't do anything, yet we still fall into this trap of acquiring it incessantly without putting it into action. Why? Because the learning loop, at its core, is procrastination masquerading as productivity. We tell ourselves that it's important work, but it's neither important nor is it work. It's easy to get stuck in this loop because it doesn't look like procrastination. You're not sitting down watching Netflix or playing video games or scrolling TikTok. You're reading books or you're taking a course or you're listening to an educational podcast. And so it's very easy to tell yourself that you're doing important things, that you're moving ahead, that you're making progress. But like I've said in other videos, it's sophisticated procrastination. There's obvious procrastination, which is doing the things that are so obviously procrastination, like Netflix when you should be working. Sophisticated procrastination is much more devious, and it's exactly what I'm talking about. It's researching beyond the point you need to research, reading the next self-help book, even though the last 10 didn't really change anything for you. There's a reason why you fall into this loop, this learning loop, this type of procrastination. I think the most common cause for most people, including myself, is uncertainty. Uncertainty is what drives you into this loop. Perhaps you want to start a business, but you're not sure what business to start, or you're not sure if it'll work out. And so you're faced with a decent amount of uncertainty. It's not comfortable to be in that state. It's normal, but it's not comfortable, right? So you're faced with uncertainty. From uncertainty flows a bunch of other consequences, such as self-doubt, fear of failure, fear of success, how others will perceive you, and so on. While Acquiring more information and knowledge can help you reduce this uncertainty. It doesn't necessarily remove it. And so there's going to come a point where you've done a sufficient amount of learning or research to come up with a simple plan, and then you need to take action despite the uncertainty that still exists. Now, in the case of doing something new, like starting your first business, that point where you have sufficient information usually comes quite early on. And the reason for that is you don't know what you don't know. You can read every business book there is in the world, but you will still feel uncertain because there are certain things that you just don't know about the industry you're entering into, about how you'll react to a situation, about how to hire people, about how to manage people. These are skills. They're not just areas of knowledge. They are skills that you must develop. And so your theoretical learning that you're doing is only so valuable compared to getting into the arena and learning on the job. This is important to understand. The point where you have enough information is not necessarily the point where you feel certain about where you're going. It's not the point where you feel certain about the decision you're about to make. It's the point where you can step back and recognize that continuing to remain in the learning loop is not going to serve you anymore. And that the only way to graduate beyond that and gain more certainty and clarity is to move in the direction of action, to do things, to do the work, to start the project, to start the business. You must take action in uncertainty. If you wait for certainty, then you'll never take it because it hardly ever comes along. And usually when it does, it's a result of action anyway. Most things worth doing are encased in uncertainty and doubt. And the only true way to reduce that uncertainty is to start on the path. The more you can get comfortable with uncertainty, the better, because uncertainty never fully goes away. As soon as you make progress on something or achieve something and reach the next level, you're faced with a different shade of uncertainty and doubt. If you're ambitious, I don't think it ever goes away. If you want to grow, I think it's always going to be there. And so you don't fully remove it. You learn how to wrestle with it better and act anyway. So we've looked at why we get stuck in the learning loop, mostly because of uncertainty. Why is it so hard to escape? First, it's because the learning loop is seductive. It promises the same dopamine hits and feeling of progress that comes from doing the work itself, but with none of the downsides. It's similar to video games in the sense that you can have someone who is very skilled, smart, talented. They can sit down, they can play a, complex video game for hours on end, but they can't seem to work on projects or maintain a job or what have you. Why is that? Well, it's because there's no downside in the video game. There's no immediate loss the same way there is in the game of business or the game of life. And so when you remove that downside but keep the dopamine hits and the feeling of progress, it's a potent combination that can be very, very addictive. The same goes with the learning loop. It feels like progress, but you're not actually moving along the path to an outcome. It's not until you look back or have a moment of clarity that you can see that you've wasted your time. This fake progress is addictive. If you're stuck in the learning loop, what you're probably doing is like reading books or something, and you'll be reading a book. This is a notebook, but let's just say it's a book. You'll be sitting there and you'll see a line or like a paragraph, a sentence, and you'll be like, this is exactly what I needed. And you'll highlight it and you'll put it in your personal knowledge management system. You'll do whatever else you do. And it will be an insight. You'll be like, I'm so glad I found this insight. This is exactly what I needed to hear. What that should do, or what that does do in an action-oriented person, is it encourages them to take action. But if you're stuck in the learning loop, you just continue the cycle. And so you continue reading a book or you pick up the next book, and at some point you get that light bulb moment again. And it just comes on intermittently every now and again, and it keeps you stuck in that cycle. It's like a slot machine, right? It's random. Like you don't know when it's going to happen, but it happens. It gives you that dopamine hit. And so you stay in the learning loop. The more light bulb moments you experience without converting them into action, the more addicted you become. The deeper into the loop you go, it becomes much harder to escape. You've developed a pattern of behavior, which is to read, listen, learn, and you get that light bulb, that reward, and then you revert again to reading and listening and learning, whereas you should be taking action instead. So we have a potent combination here, just to set the stage. It's easy to fall into the learning loop in the first place because uncertainty pervades every human life, and it's very hard to escape it because it's so addictive, because we get those dopamine hits, we get those light bulb moments without any of the downside, without having to put skin in the game or take any risk. This seductive feeling of progress and reward is what keeps us in the cycle of consumption-centric learning. We want to do the opposite. We want to be action-centric learners. Action-centric learning doesn't come as easily as consumption-centric learning. And the reason for that is that it involves risk. It involves potential for failure and rejection. It involves effort, hard effort, and it involves embracing uncertainty, the very thing that usually pushes us into the learning loop in the first place. For example, let's say you want to learn sales. The consumption-centric learner, the person who's stuck in this loop, they're going to buy or download 10 of the most popular books. They're going to listen to podcasts. They're going to watch endless call recordings of sales calls, and they're going to write down all these notes. They're going to map it all out. This is easy to do. They aren't exposed to any downside, any potential for rejection, or any really hard effort and challenge. And as a result, they don't develop any real skill. They're just taking in a bunch of theory, but they have nothing to map it onto. The action-centric learner takes a different approach. They act. They know that the only true way to learn sales is to do sales, to get on calls and learn iteratively, to make mistakes, to get rejected, to practice. And so they put themselves in a position where they are forced to learn by doing. Sure, they would do well to read some books and listen to some podcasts about sales on the side to get a bit of a framework for how to approach the sales calls in a better way. But this is in support of what they are already doing. To think about it visually, the consumption-centric learner is just looping around and not moving in any particular direction. The action-centric learner is moving forward or upwards, and they're using the consumption to support that or to increase the rate of progress. But this here is the most important thing. They're already moving in a direction with momentum and energy, and they're just using that knowledge and information to speed it up. Action-centric learning involves being in the territory itself, not just looking at the map. The map gives you an idea of what you can expect, but it's not always accurate. It doesn't tell you everything. I'll give you an example, like an actual example of a map versus a territory. I went on a hunting trip about a month ago. I looked at the map beforehand. I saw the topography. I saw what the hill looked like. I thought it was going to be an easy climb up this hill because it wasn't so steep. It was covered in spiky bush. And so my legs got cut up. It's pretty painful. But that did not show on the map, right? And so there's some things that you just cannot predict. When you're reading about sales objections in a book on sales, that's one thing. But when you're on the phone with someone and they come out with this objection that you've never heard before, it's like, whoa, how do I handle this? That's part of learning. That's part of skill development. And that only comes from being action-centric, from being in the territory itself. Now, I want to make something really clear, which is that there's nothing wrong with reading books or listening to podcasts, and for all the hate they get, self-help books put me on the right path when I was much younger. I'm grateful for that. Likewise, there have been key podcast episodes I've listened to that have really helped me in certain areas. But I do believe that consumption is 10 times more effective if you're already working hard towards a goal, mainly because you have a better filtering mechanism for the information that's coming in. If you're not already doing things, you're not taking action, you can read a book and maybe you retain like 1% of it. But if you're already doing things, you can map it on to the reality that you're experiencing and it will help you much more. Another thing to mention before someone comments about it, there are some projects that require vast amounts of research and reading and so on and so forth. If you're working on a YouTube video or an essay or something, and you need to read 8 books as part of the research process, then that's a lot of learning. But it is action-centric learning because you're doing it in support of a goal, not just randomly to procrastinate. Okay, so how do we escape the learning loop and get addicted to the real progress that comes from doing the work? Well, as you probably know by now, escaping the learning loop is not easy. Not only should you expect this to be a challenge, which is a good thing because challenge is what leads to growth, you should also realize that it's unlikely to be a one-time event. The first time I was consciously aware of the fact that I was stuck in the learning loop was probably when I was maybe 19 or 20. And I escaped it, but it's not like that was it. It came back with a vengeance some years later, and again and again and again and again, right? It's an ongoing thing that you're probably going to have to deal with for life. But the good news is you can get much better at spotting yourself fall into it and putting yourself out. The learning loop is always there waiting for you to fall back in. And so you need to work on escaping first and then work on staying out of it. If you do get trapped again and you find yourself trapped, don't get discouraged. Simply recognize what you're doing and then work on getting yourself out. As you do this more and more, you'll become aware of the triggers that pull you into it, whether it's uncertainty, doubt, or something else entirely. You'll notice it happening and you can stop it before you end up deep into it. So let me share some useful mental reframes for doing just this. The first is that you need to trust more in your ability to figure it out. When you watch a young child, like a toddler, play with toys or whatever, you can see them trying to figure things out. They're learning how the world works. They're using their hands. They're taking actions. They're moving and manipulating things to see how they respond. The square object doesn't fit in the circular hole, and so then they try the next one, the square hole, and it fits, and so on and so on. They learn. We forget that we have this natural ability to figure things out on our own. It's drilled out of us during school and university, which prioritize rote learning and theory, but it's still there. That ability is still there, hidden below the surface. And yes, of course, we can learn from other people, we can study, we can build mental models and so on and so forth, but we have an ability to figure things out for ourselves. And sometimes that's the only path towards growth, towards success, towards an outcome that you want. I gave the example of learning sales a bit earlier. The first time I had to do sales, I was stuck in the learning loop. Well, I got stuck in the learning loop because I was scared. And I read a ton of books, articles, probably watched a bunch of YouTube videos during the 3 days before my first call. I had a script in front of me, everything, right? I prepared, so I thought. In hindsight, this preparation paradoxically made me less prepared because it put me in a state where I was way too cerebral about it and way too theoretical about it. Years later, when faced with another opportunity to do sales, I did the complete opposite. I told myself that I would just take the calls and trust in my ability to figure it out. I didn't use a script. I didn't read any books. I didn't watch any YouTube videos. I might have read like one article or blog post or something. But I just told myself, it's like, I'll probably fail at a bunch of these, probably find them uncomfortable, but that's just part of the process. Not only was it far more relaxing to take this approach, it was also more enjoyable. When you trust in your ability to figure it out, you can relax into the actions. You don't need to anxiously research and plan and try to find the optimal approach. You recognize that it's going to take a volume of work, and then you get going and you just simplify things. You just move. Second thing, this is not a reframe, it's more of a tip. So is the next one. Change your consumption habits. In some severe cases, the answer may be to just limit consumption entirely, like just cut it out. If you're deep in this loop, go cold turkey. Delete social media. Stop reading books. Stop listening to podcasts. But if you're doing work that requires some degree of consumption, like I am as a writer, YouTuber, making products and all that kind of stuff, then you're probably going to need to do some level of consumption. And it's very easy to kind of like go down different rabbit holes and stuff. Instead of trying to limit or remove your consumption habit entirely, just change what you're consuming. Instead of the latest self-help books, venture back further and read old books. Instead of scrolling Twitter, read a biography. Instead of listening to the latest interesting, Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss podcast, go through like a 20-hour course on Stanford Online or something, and a topic that will help you and that you're interested in. Consume material that reminds you of who you are and leads you to action, not material that pulls you in 100 different directions and causes you to lose momentum. Speaking of things that cause you to lose momentum, leads me on to my third point, which is to cut out things that pull you out of action and momentum. For me, it was Twitter. I haven't completely cut it out, to be honest, but I have significantly reduced the time I spend on Twitter. I used to wake up in the morning and scroll while I was on the toilet. Like first thing, I would just scroll Twitter. And inevitably, almost every day, there would be a tweet from someone that would pique my interest. Maybe it was some sort of business model or idea or some piece of advice. And I'd start thinking about it. And then I'd start wondering whether I was doing the right thing in business or not. And it just led to this like constant overthinking, this constant wondering like, oh, maybe I should be doing this. This is what this guy did, or so on and so forth. And while there's nothing wrong with new ideas that can change the trajectory of your business, I think it's pretty abnormal to have like 20 of them just machine gun at you every morning. That's not normal at all. It's not good for you. For me, it kept pulling me off course and causing me to overthink things. And so I just deleted it from my phone. And so I only go on my desktop, honestly, like 10 minutes a day. And it's been a game changer. And I've significantly reduced the thing that pulled me out of action and momentum. For you, it might be something else. It might not be Twitter. Maybe you're a self-help book junkie and you go through regular phases where you try to use self-help books as a fix for feeling uncertain and unsure. You read a book, you reset your goals, you plan out your year again, you feel that fake progress that comes that feels good, and then you repeat the cycle a few weeks or months later. What would happen if you decided to not do this, but instead sat with the uncertainty and dealt with it only through action? Anyway, that's the third point. Cut out things that pull you out of momentum and action. Fourth, understand that learning by doing is never easy. If it were, then it wouldn't be learning. It's normal to feel unsure about what's going on. It's normal to feel uncertain. It's normal to feel a little bit anxious. That's part of being human. What makes it worse is trying to perfect everything before you start. Trying to acquire what you tell yourself is necessary information, but is really just procrastinating before you even kick off the start line. It's very easy to fall back into the learning loop when you encounter difficulty. You trick yourself into thinking that the challenge you're facing is a result of your lack of information and knowledge, when quite often it's simply a lack of skill. You haven't built the required skills yet to not feel challenged by the thing. And the only way you build those skills is to embrace the challenge and be open to mistakes and failure. To mistake a skill problem with an information or knowledge problem will pull you back in to the learning loop. If you want to learn sales and you've done 5 sales calls and you're like, this is challenging, it's like, yeah, it's supposed to be. You don't need to go back to the book. Like, just keep going. Do 100 more. Then go read a book about it. And that's why learning by doing is hard, because it requires violence and volume of action. But there are sometimes information bottlenecks, right? And for that, we use minimum viable learning. Occasionally, you'll encounter bottlenecks and problems and challenges along your journey that are actually a result of a lack of information. Perhaps you need to hire someone and you've never done it before. Well, it would do you well to read up on some best practices around hiring, or perhaps talk to someone, figure out what good interview questions are to ask, and so on. But as with most information bottlenecks, there's this risk of endlessly reading about it, researching, and never doing the hard action. In this case, hiring someone. So you need to approach it with the right mentality. We'll call this minimum viable learning. So you say to yourself, I'll read this one book or this one article on hiring, and then I'll make the hire. I know there's more books and articles that I could read, and maybe some of them will contain some insights that would help me. But I'm pretty sure hiring's a skill, and I'm never going to feel perfectly comfortable doing it the first few times or ever. And so that's how I'm going to approach this. So you set constraints, you acquire minimum viable information that enables you to move ahead and take the action in a way that's not completely blind. Now, some of you watching this might be thinking, well, what if I don't know what to do? What if I don't know what actions to take at all? Like step one. Every time I find myself dealing with this question, and I've dealt with it a lot, it's because my head is in the clouds and I'm ignoring what's in front of me. For example, the question of what should I do with my life? It's a very important question, but it's one that requires a mix of action and introspection. But if you keep asking that question for years and years without taking any sort of action at all, are you getting closer to answering it? You need to pull yourself back to the ground. Look at the simplest actions you can take that are in front of you. Maybe you're not sure if you want to be an artist or build a business. Well, come back and ask that question once you've created 10 paintings, once you've launched your own product, once you've done some sales. Start doing both at the same time and just see what sticks. Start putting things out into the world, being in motion, being in action, and going from there. Samuel Butler has this great quote. He says, "Do the things that you can see. They will show you those you cannot see. By doing what you can, you will gradually get to know what it is that you want to do and cannot do, and so to be able to do it." All right, if you've made it to the end of this video and it resonated with you, you feel like you're stuck in the learning loop, then you're faced with a choice. Do you continue to remain stuck in this loop, the learning loop, clicking on another YouTube video or picking up the next book, but avoiding the actions that you need to take? Or do you embrace the discomfort, the uncertainty, the challenge, and take the first step into the arena to move closer to the outcome that you want? It's your choice, but I recommend that you do the latter. If you have a list of projects and tasks that you've been putting off, then start there. What's the one thing you could work on over the next week or month that would give you momentum, that you'd be proud of completing or making progress on? Identify it and then resolve to work on it. Expect it to be hard. Expect to feel that nagging voice at the back of your head try and pull you back in, tell you that you need more information, tell you that you need to go back to the drawing board. Quiet that voice and continue. Do the work. When you get stuck, figure out what the bottleneck is, figure out what you need in order to solve it. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any thoughts on this topic, leave them below. Make sure to hit like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.